Where are the others?
I don't know.
Tell me now!
The snow came down soft that night over Fort Haven, Virginia. Not the hard-driving snow of a storm. The quiet kind. The kind that muffled sound and softened edges and made the world feel for just a moment like it was holding its breath. It was the kind of night that made young soldiers feel philosophical and old soldiers feel their knees. Specialist Lena Voss felt neither. She was walking back from the Eastern Server Annex, a black diagnostic case in her left hand and a tablet tucked under her right arm, her gray access badge swinging gently against her chest with each step. Her boots made almost no sound on the packed gravel path. She was not trying to be quiet. She simply was. The four of them came from between the equipment sheds. They didn't announce themselves. Didn't need to. Four sets of boots crunching on frozen gravel at 11 o'clock at night, fanning out in a practiced half circle around a single woman. The geometry of it said everything. They were in PT gear, their faces carrying that specific blankness that men wear when they've been told to do something they've already decided to enjoy. Lena stopped walking. She stood still for one breath, then two. Her eyes moved across all four of them with the attentive neutrality of someone reading a system readout, not searching for threat, just cataloging data. Weight distribution, dominant hands. The way the tall one on the left was already shifting his balance forward. The way the one directly ahead had his chin slightly raised, performing for an audience that wasn't there. She set the diagnostic case down on the gravel, gently, like she was setting it on a shelf. 41 seconds later, she picked it up again. The four of them were on the ground in a pattern so geometrically even it looked almost planned, two to her left, one straight ahead, one behind her, each disarmed and neutralized with a precision that left no room for interpretation. No broken bones, no permanent damage. Just four men who had walked into a situation they had fundamentally misread, now lying in the quiet snow, staring at a sky that had no answers for them. Lena brushed a fine layer of snow from the lid of her diagnostic case. She checked the tablet screen. The diagnostic cycle she had started 20 minutes ago had completed. Green across the board. She tucked it back under her arm. She picked up the gray badge from where it had fallen, wiped it clean on her sleeve, and hung it back around her neck. Then she walked back to the barracks and went to sleep. She did not file an incident report. She did not tell anyone what had happened. She did not replay the 41 seconds in her head before she closed her eyes. Within 4 minutes of lying down, her breathing was slow and even and completely, absolutely calm. Because to Lena Voss, what had just happened was background noise. And she was very good at filtering out background noise. Fort Haven had been carved out of the Virginia Highlands in 1943, originally built to house signal intelligence operations during the Second World War. The old brick buildings from that era still stood along the western perimeter, their walls thick and their windows narrow, built for a time when secrecy meant stone and distance, rather than encryption and fiber optic cable. The newer structures were different, glass and poured concrete, server halls that hummed at a constant low frequency you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Climate-controlled rooms where the temperature was held within a single degree and the air smelled faintly of ozone and cooling fans. The base sat at the intersection of three things. The military valued elevation, isolation, and proximity to the underground cable infrastructure that connected the eastern seaboard's defense networks to one another, like the nervous system of some vast invisible creature. It was in the language of the people who worked there, a signals base, which was another way of saying it was a place where information was the weapon, and the people who understood information best were theoretically the most powerful people on the installation. Theoretically. In practice, power at Fort Haven operated the way it operated everywhere else in the United States military. It moved through rank and volume and the accumulated social gravity of men who had been in combat and wore the proof of it on their chest. Information mattered, but presence mattered more. And no one had more presence at Fort Haven in the winter of that year than Master Sergeant Brett Calloway. He was 41 years old and built like something that had been assembled rather than born. 6 feet 2 inches of force recon muscle and institutional confidence with a jaw that looked like it could take a direct hit from a reasonable argument and suffer no structural damage whatsoever. He had done 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan, and he wore his service the way some men wore their faith, not quietly, not as a private thing, but as a proclamation. A constant broadcasting of identity that demanded acknowledgement from every room he entered. He held court every morning at the CrossFit rig on the south side of the base, his laughter hitting the concrete blast walls and bouncing back twice as loud, drawing junior Marines and young infantry soldiers the way fire draws moths. He was the son of his own small solar system, and everyone within range understood their role was to orbit. He was not a cruel man. It is important to say that clearly. He was not the kind of man who enjoyed causing pain for its own sake. He was the kind of man who had spent 20 years in a world where size and aggression and the willingness to do difficult things under terrible conditions were the currencies of respect. He was the kind of man who had survived things that would have destroyed most people and who had organized the entire architecture of his identity around those survivals, which meant that anything that didn't fit that architecture, anything quiet, anything technical, anything that measured its value in datum rather than deeds registered to him as lesser, as decoration, as something that existed in the margins of the real world, which was the world he lived in. When he first saw Lena Voss, she was crossing the main quadrangle with her head down and a tablet in her hand and a gray GS-13 access badge swinging from the lanyard around her neck. The gray badge was the lowest civilian contractor clearance issued at Fort Haven. It got you through the front gate. It got you into the general access buildings. It did not get you anywhere near anything that mattered. Calloway saw the gray badge before he saw the woman wearing it. He took in the slight frame, the hair pulled back in a severe functional bun, the ballistic glasses with the dark lenses, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that she was walking through a military installation and might consider adjusting her posture accordingly. He turned to the Lance Corporal beside him and made a comment. The Lance Corporal laughed. Calloway forgot about her by the time he reached the squat rack. 3 weeks before the night of the snow and the 4 men on the gravel, Lena had arrived at Fort Haven on a Tuesday afternoon in a government sedan that smelled of carpet cleaner and someone else's lunch. Her official paperwork said she was there to conduct a pre-deployment systems audit of the Sentinel network, a final technical review before the platform went live across 14 major installations along the eastern seaboard. The audit had been scheduled for 6 weeks. The deployment was in 72 hours measured from the morning she arrived. The official paperwork was not incorrect. It was simply incomplete. The person who had sent her, a senior director at the NSA, whose name appeared on very few documents and whose office technically did not exist on any organizational chart, had given her a second set of instructions that had not been written down anywhere. 6 weeks prior, automated analysis tools monitoring Sentinel's administrative logs had flagged a pattern of access anomalies. Small things, tiny things, the kind of irregularities that looked like system noise to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. Access timestamps that didn't quite line up. Authentication tokens refreshed at slightly wrong intervals. Query signatures that were technically valid but carried a specific fingerprint that the automated tools had no framework to interpret. Lena had a framework. She had built Sentinel's authentication architecture from the ground up 4 years earlier, working 18-hour days in a windowless office in Maryland. She had written over 500,000 lines of its source code. She understood its structure the way a composer understands a symphony, not just what the notes were, but why they were placed where they were, what they were meant to do, and what it would sound like if someone started changing them without telling the conductor. The fingerprint in the logs wasn't random. It was intentional, and it belonged to someone with administrative-level access to Sentinel's core systems. At Fort Haven, 3 people held that level of access. Colonel Theodore Marsh, the base commander. Master Sergeant Brett Calloway, whose Force Recon unit was responsible for the physical security of Sentinel's external sensor nodes. And Lieutenant Colonel Renata Stowe, the deputy commander and the woman who had 11 years ago sat across a seminar table from a 21-year-old MIT graduate student and told her that the most important skill an engineer could develop was the ability to see the system she was building from the perspective of the person who wanted to break it. Lena had not told anyone at Fort Haven what she was actually looking for. Not Marsh, not Calloway, not Stowe. She had simply arrived, accepted her gray badge without comment, been assigned a bunk in the contractor quarters and a workstation in the SCIF, and begun doing what she did. She watched. She listened. She filtered. She was, as she had always been, very good at filtering. The armory occupied the ground floor of Building 7, the oldest standing structure on Fort Haven's eastern side. The walls were original 1943 brick, 3 feet thick, and the air inside carried a permanent combination of hop solvent and gun oil, and the specific metallic coolness of well-maintained steel. Racks of M4s and M249s stood in ordered rows along the south wall. Calloway had once described it to a new lieutenant as his church. The new lieutenant had laughed. Calloway had not been joking. It was there 4 days after her arrival that the first real confrontation happened. Lena had requisitioned access to the Armory's northwest storage bay to run diagnostics on Sentinel's Node 7 junction assembly. a critical piece of hardware that physically bridged the sensor network's fiber connections to the base's main power and data infrastructure. The junction assembly lived in the armory, not because it was a weapon, but because Building 7 had the best climate control on the installation, the most reliable backup power, and the most rigorous physical security. The armory's records showed Node 7 had last been serviced 14 months ago. Lena needed to verify its baseline before she could certify anything about the wider network. She had been there for 40 minutes when Calloway arrived with 3 of his men. She was kneeling in front of an open Pelican case, her fingers moving across a fiber diagnostic console with practiced ease. Lines of initialization code scrolled across her tablet screen. A small green indicator light on the junction assembly blinked steadily. The rest of the world had gone quiet and gray at the edges in the way it always did when she was working. She heard Calloway before she saw him. The sound of his boots was different from his men's, not louder but more deliberate. The boots of a man accustomed to having his footsteps heard. His shadow fell across the Pelican case. What in the hell is this? It was not a question. It was issued the way artillery is issued, designed to produce a specific effect at a specific range. The effect it was designed to produce was a startled flinch, a stammered explanation, a tacit acknowledgement that his authority in this space was total and her presence required his permission. Lena completed the command string she was running. Her fingers finished the last 3 keystrokes with the same rhythm they'd been maintaining since before he walked in. The green indicator light blinked confirmation. Then, and only then, she raised her head. She looked at him through the dark lenses of her ballistic glasses. Her expression was the same expression she'd had when she was looking at the diagnostic readout 30 seconds earlier. Neutral, attentive, completely unmoved. Running a baseline integrity check on the Node 7 junction assembly, Master Sergeant. Her voice was flat and clear and utterly without inflection. A statement of fact offered in the same tone you'd read a weather report. Calloway stared at her. He had been doing this for 20 years. He knew the full spectrum of responses that statement was supposed to produce: the startle, the deference, the instinctive social recalibration that happened when someone of his physical presence and institutional authority entered a room and announced his displeasure. He had seen it in recruits and in officers and in civilians twice his age. He did not see it now. "I don't remember giving clearance for POGs to run science projects in my house," he said. The derogatory term for non-infantry personnel landed in the air between them like a thrown stone. Behind him, his 2 corporals produced the obligatory low chuckle of men performing loyalty. "This particular science project," Lena said, her hands continuing to move across the diagnostic console with no change in rhythm, "is the hardware that tells your unit what to shoot at. Its last service was 14 months ago. An unchecked junction failure in a live network creates a blind spot in external sensor coverage. I'm here to ensure that doesn't happen before deployment." She began packing the diagnostic components back into the Pelican case. Each piece went into its foam cutout in the exact right position, oriented the exact right way. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, moving through the checklist the way she moved through everything without excess. Calloway felt a specific heat building in his face. He knew this heat. It was the heat of being corrected by someone who had no business correcting him, of being answered with logic in a space where he ruled by something older and more fundamental than logic. "You got a smart mouth for someone with a gray badge." He stepped closer. He was very good at the physics of intimidation. The reduction of distance, the use of physical scale, the slight forward lean that communicated without words that he occupied more of the world than you did. "When operators are working, technicians, stay out of the way. Pack up your gear and clear out before you break a nail." Lena paused. She closed the lid of the Pelican case. The latches engaged with 3 clean metallic snaps. She placed the tablet on top of the case. Then she stood. She was almost a foot shorter than him. Standing, the difference in their physical scale was significant enough to be almost comic. She lifted her ballistic glasses and set them on top of her head, and for the first time he saw her eyes directly. They were a pale gray, the color of overcast sky over winter water. There was no fear in them, no anger, no deference. They were the eyes of a person who was looking at a problem and calculating the most efficient path to its resolution. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then she lowered her glasses back onto her face, picked up the Pelican case in one hand and her tablet in the other, and walked toward the door. Her footsteps made almost no sound on the concrete floor. She walked past Calloway without looking at him again. Not because she was afraid, not because she was conceding anything, but because the conversation was over and she had work to do, and the man standing in front of her was no longer a relevant variable in the equation she was solving. She was 3 steps past him when he felt it the specific hollow absence of the reaction he had needed. She had not flinched, had not apologized, had not adjusted herself 1 degree in response to his presence. She had simply processed him as an obstacle routed around him and continued moving toward her objective. He had been handled. The realization settled into him the way cold water settles into ground, slowly, thoroughly reaching places he hadn't expected it to reach. He stood in his church in front of his altar and watched a woman with a gray badge walk out of his space like it was a corridor she was passing through on her way to somewhere that actually mattered. His corporals were quiet. The laughter from 30 seconds ago had evaporated without either of them consciously deciding to stop. The space it had occupied now felt hollow and slightly embarrassing. From the northwest corner of the armory where the auxiliary equipment racks cast deep shadow, a figure stepped forward. Senior Chief Donovan Hale had been standing there for the better part of 12 minutes. He was 38 years old, compact, and still with the particular quality of silence that certain men develop after years of operating in environments where making a sound at the wrong moment meant something unrecoverable. He had been at Fort Haven for 2 weeks on a joint training exercise, and in those 2 weeks, he had said very little to very few people. He had, however, watched a great deal. He watched Lena walk out of the armory. Then he turned his eyes to Calloway. "You just said all of that," Hale said to the wrong person, Gunny. His voice was quiet, not soft. There was nothing soft about it, just quiet the way a correctly calibrated instrument is quiet, precise and without excess. Calloway turned to look at him. "That's so. That's so. And why is that exactly?" Hale looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then he looked back at Calloway. Something moved behind his eyes, not amusement, not contempt. Something more like the expression a man has when he knows how a story ends and is watching it begin. "You'll figure it out," he said. Then he walked out of the armory, his footsteps making no more sound than hers had. Calloway stood in the silence of his church and felt for a reason he could not articulate profoundly unsettled. He stayed that way for a long time. That evening in the SCIF, Lena sat in the blue light of her workstation and followed the fingerprint. She had been following it for 3 weeks, building the picture, one data point at a time, the way you build a composite image, one layer, then another, until the shape beneath them becomes unmistakable. She had been careful. She had been thorough. She had been patient in a way that had nothing to do with virtue and everything to do with the way her mind was constructed. She needed evidence, not a theory. Evidence, the log access patterns, the authentication anomalies, the micro adjustments to Node 7's configuration that were technically within normal operating parameters, but were not, in her judgment, the product of routine maintenance. Everything pointed in the same direction. Everything carried the same fingerprint. She ran the cross-reference one more time. The result came back in 4 seconds. She looked at it. The name on the screen belonged to the woman who had 11 years ago sat across a seminar table from a 21-year-old MIT graduate student and told her that the most important skill an engineer could develop was the ability to see the system she was building from the perspective of the person who wanted to break it. Lieutenant Colonel Renata Stowe. Lena set the tablet down on the desk in front of her. She placed both hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall. 8 seconds. She looked at the wall for 8 seconds and did not move, and did not speak, and did not perform any of the calculations she normally performed continuously and automatically. For those 8 seconds, she was simply a 32-year-old woman who had just found the name of someone important on a list where it had no business being. She was someone who felt in the specific physical way that only actual human beings can feel it, the particular weight of a fact that changes every assumption you had been operating under. 8 seconds. Then she picked up the tablet. She adjusted the search parameters. She kept working. The crisis arrived the following morning, not with a bang, but with a flicker. At 06:14 in the main Tactical Operations Center, a segment of Fort Haven's northern perimeter sensor coverage went dark. Not a single node. An entire sector. Sector Echo. On the main display, the icons representing Sentinel's external sensor array, acoustic, seismic, thermal, electromagnetic, vanished from the map one by one, over the course of 11 seconds, replaced by a single pulsing amber indicator that the system used to flag critical hardware failures. The amber indicator was not the worst possible status. Red was the worst. But amber, in a network that had been certified as operational for 26 months and was scheduled for full deployment in less than 72 hours, was very bad. Colonel Theodore Marsh stood before the screen with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the particular expression of controlled concern that senior commanders develop the way athletes develop muscle memory. He was 54 years old, lean, and weathered with the eyes of a man who had been making decisions in difficult situations long enough that difficulty had stopped surprising him. He had been through the Gulf War as a junior officer and through 2 decades of institutional leadership since then, and he had learned that the most important thing a commander could do in the first 30 seconds of a crisis was resist the impulse to fill silence with noise. He let the silence hold for exactly 30 seconds. Then he said, "Report." The young watch officer, whose face had gone a shade of pale that only civilians and very new soldiers achieve, said, "Sir, we've lost the entire sector echo array. The sector junction is non-responsive. 14 sensor nodes offline. Cause: unknown, sir. Could be equipment failure. Could be external interference. Could be is not a status report, Lieutenant." Marsh's voice did not rise. It simply became more precise, each word placed with the deliberate care of a surgeon. "Get me a physical assessment team. Get me the network diagnostic lead. And get me Calloway." He turned back to the screen. The amber indicator pulsed. In the corner of the room against the server rack, Lena Voss stood with a diagnostic handset in her hand. She had been in the TOC for 30 minutes running a routine cross-check on the building's internal sensor feeds. She had not been summoned. She had not inserted herself into the developing situation. She was simply there watching the amber indicator pulse and running the numbers in her head. She was thinking about fingerprints. She was thinking about access logs. She was thinking about the names she had seen on her screen the night before. She was thinking about the 72 hours remaining before Sentinel went live across 14 installations. And for the first time since arriving at Fort Haven, Lena Voss felt something shift beneath the surface of her calm. Not fear, not panic, something more precise than either. The specific cold urgency of a person who understands exactly how much is at stake and exactly how little time there is to address it. She watched the screen. The amber light pulsed. And in the quiet of that room on that cold Virginia morning, with snow still falling soft outside, the clock began to run. The TOC had a particular smell when things went wrong. It was not the smell of smoke or blood or any of the dramatic markers of crisis that people who had never been in one imagined. It was the smell of coffee going cold in paper cups and the sharp, slightly acrid edge of bodies under stress and the ozone burn of equipment running harder than it was designed to run. It was the smell of humans and machines, both working past their comfortable limits, and it was a smell that Lena had learned to read the way other people read faces. The room was working past its comfortable limits. Marsh stood at the center of it with the stillness of a man who had made a career out of being the calmest person in difficult rooms. His watch officers moved around him in tight, efficient orbits, pulling data and issuing status requests, and generating the controlled chaos of a command structure, trying to get its arms around a problem that was still defining itself. Radio traffic filled the background, short, clipped exchanges in the flat professional language of people who had been trained to excise emotion from their communications. Calloway came through the door at 0623. He was already geared up. Not fully, no plates, no helmet, but he had his rifle slung and his kit half assembled in the way of a man who had heard the alarm and was already deciding how he was going to respond before he knew what the alarm was for. He moved through the room with the forward-leaning momentum of someone who had identified the problem as one that required a physical solution and was already calculating the geometry of that solution. He stopped at the display, read the screen, looked at Marsh. "Sector Echo," he said. "Sector Echo," Marsh confirmed. Calloway looked at the amber indicator for 3 seconds. Then he said, "My team can handle this, sir. We run a patrol out to the sector junction, assess the hardware, get eyes on the dead space. We're already staged." He said it with the confidence of a man presenting a solution he had presented many times before, direct, clean, assured. In and out inside 40 minutes. Marsh looked at him the way a chess player looks at a move that is technically legal, but strategically ill-considered. "The sector junction sits at the base of the Echo Ravine," Marsh said. "If Sector Echo went down because of hardware failure, your team finds the fault and we restore coverage. If it went down because of deliberate action, then we deal with whatever put it down," Calloway said. His voice carried a flat certainty that was not arrogance exactly. It was something more deeply embedded than arrogance. It was the bone-level conviction of a man who had spent 20 years being functionally the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. "If it went down because of deliberate action," Marsh said more slowly this time, "then the approach corridor to that junction is the most logical place to position a response. And a 4-man fire team moving in a standard patrol pattern through a narrow ravine at 0600 is not a tactical insertion. It is a target." The room had gone quiet around them. Not completely, radio still murmured, fingers still moved across keyboards, But the quality of the ambient noise had changed. People were listening. From the server rack in the corner, Lena spoke. Sending a patrol is a tactical error. She said it the way she said everything, evenly, without volume, with the absolute unself-conscious directness of a person who has identified the correct answer and sees no reason to cushion it. Every head in the room turned. Calloway's jaw tightened in the specific way of a man who has just had a wound touched that he was not aware he had. Specialist, he said. The word landed with the weight of a warning. No one in this room needs your input on tactical operations. Stay in your lane. Lena did not look at him. She looked at Marsh. The seismic logs from the adjacent nodes show microvibration signatures consistent with ground disturbance within 40 meters of the sector junction. The pattern started 8 hours ago and ran for approximately 90 minutes. I pulled the acoustic records before they went dark. The signature is deliberate and professional. She held up the diagnostic handset. Whoever took down Sector Echo knows the approach corridor. A standard patrol moves into a prepared position. 4 men in a ravine with one way in and one way out is not a response. It's a delivery. The room was completely quiet now. Marsh looked at the diagnostic handset, then at Lena, then at the amber indicator on the screen. The expression on his face was one that Lena had seen before, not on military officers specifically, but on people of intelligence and responsibility, in the moment when a correct analysis lands in direct conflict with an institutional preference. The moment when what the data says and what the culture wants are pointing in opposite directions. He said, "What's your recommended approach?" Specialist Calloway made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "With respect, sir, we're not taking tactical advice from—" I asked Specialist Voss a question, Master Sergeant. The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. Something calcified in Calloway's face, then went still. Lena said, "Single operator, minimal gear, minimal signature. Someone who understands the system architecture well enough to diagnose the fault on site and either repair it or extract the data needed for a remote repair. The junction is 800 meters from the Echo perimeter access point. One person moving on a non-standard route through the ravine terrain is invisible. 4 people moving on any road are not." Calloway set his jaw. "One person in that terrain at dawn is a suicide run." "One person who knows what they're doing," Lena said, "is the only option that doesn't announce itself." Marsh looked at the screen. He looked at the amber indicator. He looked at the clock on the wall above it. He looked at Lena. "Get your kit," he said. "You have 10 minutes." Calloway's face underwent a sequence of changes that happened too fast to fully track disbelief, then outrage, then the particular blankness of a man whose objection has been not just overruled, but simply passed over as though it were a speed bump rather than a wall. "Sir," his voice was controlled but tight, "you are proposing to send a civilian contractor with a gray access badge into a potentially hostile external sector. I am aware of what I'm proposing, Gunny. My team." "Your team," Marsh said, and his voice dropped half a register into the frequency that ended conversations, "is standing down from direct action on Echo. I am authorizing an alternate approach." He paused. He looked at Calloway for 2 full seconds with the patient, direct regard of a man who is being very deliberate about what he says next. "I will allow your team to establish overwatch on the northern ridge above the ravine. Observation only. You do not move on the junction. You do not engage unless I authorize it. That is your mission. Am I clear?" Calloway stood very still. "Clear, sir," he said. Each word had the sound of something being swallowed. He turned and walked out of the TOC. His men fell in behind him. The door closed. Marsh turned back to the screen. The amber indicator pulsed twice in the silence. Lena was already gone from the corner. She was in the equipment staging room adjacent to the TOC, moving through the process of gearing up without excess. Minimal plate carrier over her sterile fatigues. No rank, no unit identifier. The gray badge stayed around her neck, not from obligation, but because she had not thought about it, which was itself a kind of statement. A compact radio handset clipped to her left shoulder. A tablet in a ruggedized field case on her right hip. She was checking the field case latches when Hale came through the door. He did not announce himself. He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment in the fluorescent quiet of the staging room, looking at her with the evaluating calm of a man who has made a career out of reading situations correctly. He was carrying something. It was a rifle, not a standard-issue weapon. A Ruger precision rifle configured for suppressed operation compact fitted with an integral suppressor that reduced its profile while eliminating most of its acoustic signature. It was a specialist tool, the kind of thing that did not appear on standard equipment manifests. the kind of thing that existed in the particular gray space between official inventory and operational reality that certain experienced operators navigated with ease. Hale crossed the room and set it on the equipment table in front of her. He did not say anything. He did not offer context or explanation. He simply placed it there and stepped back and looked at her with the expression of a person making an offering between two professionals in a language that did not require words. Lena looked at the rifle. She looked at Hale. Then she picked it up. Her hands moved across it with a familiarity that had nothing to do with the role listed on her official paperwork. She checked the action with a practiced, efficient sequence that took less than 8 seconds, cleared the chamber, verified the suppressor mount, felt the balance of it, the way the weight distributed between her hands, the way the stock aligned against her shoulder. In the brief moment she raised it, it was correctly assembled. It was correctly maintained. It was, in the judgment of her hands, a good tool. She looked at Hale. He gave her a single nod. She gave him a single nod back. That was all either of them needed. She slung the rifle and picked up her field case. She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. "You pulled me out of a burning server room in 2018 and told no one you were there," she said. Hale said, "I know." "Why not?" He looked at her for a moment, steady and without performance. "Same reason you won't file a report about last night." She held that for 1 second. There was something in the economy of it, the way he had reduced the architecture of an unspoken mutual understanding to a single sentence that registered as its own kind of precision. Then she walked out. Hale stood in the staging room and listened to her footsteps fade down the passage toward the external access door. Then he went back to the TOC to watch the screen. The amber indicator was still pulsing. He settled into a chair in the corner with the stillness of a man who was very good at waiting, and he watched it pulse, and he did not take his eyes off the display. He knew what she was. He was the only person on Fort Haven who did. He thought that was probably about to change. The ravine that formed the eastern boundary of Sector Echo was not a dramatic geological feature. It was not the kind of landscape that found its way into photographs or memory. It was simply a long, irregular crease in the Virginia Highlands terrain, 50 to 70 feet deep. In most places, its walls composed of fractured shale and compacted red clay, its floor a narrow strip of frozen creek bed flanked by scrub growth that had long since gone gray and brittle in the winter cold. It was the kind of terrain that looked on a map like a straightforward approach corridor. The kind of terrain that looked to a trained eye like a place someone had spent time thinking about. Lena did not use the approach corridor. She came into the ravine from the south across a section of terrain that the topographic survey listed as impassable due to a combination of steep grade and unstable shale surface. It was not impassable. It was simply unpleasant and required a specific understanding of how weight, imbalance, and friction interacted on a 40-degree slope of wet rock in the pre-dawn cold. She moved without a light. She moved without the thermal masking gear that would have made her invisible to the sentinel sensors still operational in adjacent sectors. She moved instead through the specific quality of knowledge that comes from having designed the system, knowing where every sensor was positioned, knowing exactly which angles fell into natural dead zones created by terrain features, knowing the precise gaps in coverage that no network was wide enough or dense enough to fully eliminate. She was not invisible. She was simply moving through the spaces between visibility, the way water moves through the spaces in rock. The snow had stopped by the time she reached the ravine floor. The sky was the color of old pewter pre-dawn light coming up pale and flat from the east. Her breath made small, brief clouds in the cold air. She kept her movement slow enough that those clouds dissipated before they could register on the thermal sensors at the ravine's northern end. She was thinking about the seismic data she had pulled before leaving the TOC, the micro-vibration patterns, the specific signature of ground disturbance within 40 meters of the sector junction. She was cross-referencing it against the topographic memory she carried of this terrain from 4 years of working with Sentinel's design specifications. The pattern was consistent with two specific things: equipment installation or excavation. If it was installation, there was something in the ground near the junction that hadn't been there before. If it was excavation, there was something in the ground near the junction that had been removed. She thought about Stowe. She thought about the fingerprint in the logs. She thought about the 8 months of access anomalies she had traced back to a single source. And she thought about the woman who had taught her to look at every system she built from the perspective of the person who wanted to break it. She reached the sector junction at 0641. The junction housing was a gray metal cabinet, roughly the size of a large equipment locker, bolted to a concrete anchor post at the base of the ravine's eastern wall. It was exactly where the installation schematic said it would be. It showed no obvious physical damage, no blast scarring, no impact marks, no evidence of forced access. Lena circled it once before she touched it. She moved around its perimeter slowly, her eyes tracking not the cabinet itself but the ground around it. The snow surface, the disturbed gravel at the base of the anchor post, the slight irregularity in the soil composition approximately 30 meters to the northwest. She crouched at the irregularity. The ground there had been worked, carefully, professionally worked. The surface had been relayed with enough precision that it would have taken another 15 minutes of looking to find it without the seismic data as a guide. She did not dig. She noted the position, noted the dimensions, noted the specific angle of the disturbance relative to the junction housing, and filed it. Then she stood and opened the junction cabinet. The fiber optic bundle that connected the sector echo array to Sentinel's primary data spine had been severed. Not cut, carelessly severed with a precision tool at a specific point in the cable run where the splice would be maximally difficult to access and minimally visible to a quick inspection. The cut was clean enough to have been made by someone who understood exactly what they were doing, someone who knew which fiber carried which function, someone who understood the architecture from the inside. Lena set her field case on the ground beside the cabinet. She opened it. Her hands found the tools she needed without looking. She was 3 minutes into the repair when the first sound came over her radio. It was Calloway's voice, not the voice she had heard in the armory or in the TOC. It was tight and controlled in the way of a man applying a great deal of deliberate effort to keeping it tight and controlled, and the effort was not fully succeeding. November actual, this is Overwatch. We are taking fire. I say again, we are taking fire. Multiple positions, Northern Ridge approach. We are pinned, requesting immediate, a burst of static, then silence. Then the carrier wave returning. Lena paused her work. She listened. Calloway's team was pinned on the Northern Ridge, the ridge directly above the ravine, directly above her position. She looked at the open junction cabinet. She looked at the repair she was 3 minutes into. She looked at the ruggedized tablet on her hip, which was running a live feed of operational sensor data from Sentinel's still functional adjacent sectors. The tactical picture assembled itself in her mind with the speed and precision of a system doing what it was designed to do. 2 shooter positions on the Northern Ridge, 1 elevated position on the ravine's eastern wall, approximately 200 meters south of her location. The fire pattern was not suppression, it was containment. Calloway's team was being held in place rather than being destroyed. That meant the objective was not to kill them. The objective was to keep them where they were, while something else happened somewhere else. She looked at the ground disturbance 30 meters to the northwest. She looked at the open junction cabinet. She looked at the repair in her hands. She made the calculation in roughly 4 seconds. Then she set down the splice tool, picked up the Ruger, and moved northwest. She found the first shooter position at the base of the ravine's north wall, where a natural overhang of shale created a pocket of deep shadow invisible from above. 2 men well-equipped and well-camouflaged, working a fire pattern with the disciplined rotation of people who had trained together. They were focused entirely on the ridge above. They had not considered that a threat might come from below and behind, moving through terrain that their own tactical planning had classified as impassable. Their planning had been correct for most people. Lena was not most people. She was 30 feet away before either of them registered the change in their environment. By the time that registration produced a response, she was already moving through the gap between what they were watching and what they were not watching. 2 shots, suppressed, no louder than a car door closing firmly. Both men were down and disarmed before the sound of the second shot had finished dissipating in the cold air. She took the radio from the nearest man, listened to the traffic for 14 seconds, confirmed the fire coordination pattern, confirmed the positions of the remaining elements, then set it down and moved on. The second position was on the eastern wall 40 meters south. A single shooter using the ridge line for elevation, maintaining the northern arc of containment on Calloway's team. He was very good. His position was well chosen. His camouflage was professional, and he was completely absorbed in the problem in front of him. The 4 men on the ridge who were pinned and trying to move and failing to find a gap in the fire pattern. He had no gap in his own rear arc. Lena came up from below his position along the ravine wall, using the shale outcroppings as cover and the frozen creek bed as a sound baffle. When she reached the base of his position, she stopped and waited for the rhythm of his fire pattern to complete a cycle. In the pause between cycles, she moved. 1 shot, suppressed. The shooter folded over his weapon without a sound. She kept moving north along the ravine floor, back toward the junction cabinet, back toward the work she had left unfinished. She pulled her radio and spoke 2 words on the TOC frequency. Echo clear. Then she put the radio away and kept moving. On the northern ridge, the weight of fire that had pinned Calloway's team for 11 minutes suddenly inexplicably stopped. The silence came down like a physical thing, sudden and absolute, and deeply disorienting after the concentrated noise of the previous minutes. Calloway lay against a granite outcropping with his rifle up, and his team spread along the ridge in the defensive pattern they had moved into when the contact started, and he felt the silence arrive and did not immediately trust it. He had been in enough engagements to know that sudden silence could mean withdrawal, or it could mean a shift in positioning, or it could mean something else entirely. He stayed down, he stayed still, he scanned. The fire did not resume. After 30 seconds, he raised his head. He scanned the positions he had tracked during the engagement. Nothing moved. The rigid line across the ravine was empty and still. The eastern wall showed no signatures. He got on the radio. November actual overwatch. Contact has ceased. I say again, contact has ceased. Cause unknown. Requesting status. From the TOS, Hale's voice came back quiet and precise, and carrying beneath the professional flatness of it, something that sounded just barely like the ghost of satisfaction. Overwatch standby. Calloway stayed behind the granite outcropping and looked down into the ravine below him and tried to understand what had just happened. Nothing moved. The snow had started again, very light, the same quiet kind as the night before. It fell into the ravine and onto the ridge and settled on the still forms of the men below, who had been there and were not there anymore. And Calloway stared at all of it and felt for the first time in a very long time like someone had walked through a room he thought was his and rearranged everything without asking his permission and without needing his help. In the ravine, 800 meters to the south, Lena Voss was back at the junction cabinet with her splice tool in her hand. The fiber work took 6 minutes. The secondary power reroute took 90 seconds. The configuration reset took 40 seconds. Her hands worked with the precision of someone repairing an instrument they had built themselves, which was exactly what she was doing. Then she went still. She had found in the junction cabinet's internal log a configuration file she had not written. It had been inserted through the administrative access channel, Stowe's channel, with a timestamp from 11 days ago. It was small, elegant, ruthlessly efficient, the kind of code that takes years of deep system knowledge to produce. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. It was not a simple backdoor. It was not a surveillance tool. It was a targeted modification to Sentinel's threat identification protocol, a change that would, under specific triggering conditions, cause the network to reclassify its own operator authentication signals as hostile signatures. Conditions that would be met automatically and irreversibly at the moment Sentinel went live across all 14 installations. She sat very still in the cold ravine, with the junction cabinet open in front of her, and the implications assembling themselves into a picture that was much larger and much worse than anything she had projected when she arrived at Fort Haven 3 weeks ago. If Sentinel deployed on schedule, it would not protect 14 military installations. It would, at the moment of activation, identify all authenticated military users as threats. It would lock them out of their own systems. It would shut down their access to communication, to sensor data, to defensive capabilities. It would blind them completely and simultaneously. And in that window of blindness, anyone who knew the timing would have an opening of approximately 40 minutes during which 14 of the most sensitive military installations on the eastern seaboard would be functionally defenseless. She looked at the timestamp on the configuration file. 11 days ago. She looked at the deployment countdown in the corner of her tablet screen. 61 hours remaining. Then she thought about the 3 formal reports she had found buried in Sentinel's administrative archive during her second week at Fort Haven. Reports submitted through official channels, reports detailing a critical vulnerability in the network's threat identification architecture, reports that carried Stowe's name and Stowe's credentials and Stowe's signature, and which had been received logged and buried under 3 different layers of administrative inaction. 8 months ago, 7 months ago, 6 months ago, 3 times. The same warning. 3 times no response. Lena sat in the cold ravine and looked at the code that was going to be her mentor's destruction and her vindication simultaneously, and she understood something with a clarity that felt almost physical. Stowe had not done this to cause harm. Stowe had done this to stop it. The methods were wrong, they were dangerously, irreversibly wrong, and Lena would not excuse them or defend them. But she understood them with a completeness that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with the specific terrible logic of a technically brilliant person who has been ignored 3 times about something that matters and has run out of legitimate options. She pulled the configuration file. She backed it up to her encrypted field drive. She documented the timestamp, the access credentials, the modification architecture. She did the job she had come here to do. Then she closed the junction cabinet, latched it, stood up, and looked at the pale morning sky above the ravine walls. In the TOC, the amber indicator had already begun its transition. Amber, then a brief uncommitted flicker, then green. Hale watched the indicator change and said nothing. He did not celebrate. He simply noted it the way a skilled observer notes the arrival of a predicted event with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has been in enough operations to know that the moment the first problem is solved is also the moment the second problem reveals itself. He looked at the green indicator. He thought about 61 hours. He thought about 14 installations. He was waiting for her to come back through the door because he had been in this business long enough to know that the thing you think is the problem is rarely the whole problem. And the woman walking back through the snow toward Fort Haven was carrying something in her field drive that was going to make the morning's events look like a prologue. He waited. The door did not open yet. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and quiet, blanketing the ravine and the ridge, and the still forms of the men who had underestimated the wrong person on the wrong morning. Somewhere in that white silence, Lena Voss was walking back. And she was not walking back empty-handed. She came through the external access door at 0724. The snow was in her hair and on the shoulders of her plate carrier and in the fine creases of her field gear, and she was moving at the same unhurried pace she had maintained since she left. Not the pace of a person returning from something routine, but not the pace of a person returning from something harrowing either. It was simply her pace, the pace of a machine that had been running at its designed operational parameters and had not been pushed beyond them. The TOC went quiet when she walked in. Not the theatrical quiet of a crowd parting for a returning hero, something subtler and more genuine than that. The quiet of people who had been watching a sensor screen for the past hour and a half and who understood, in the specific technical language of their profession, exactly what the transition from amber to green had required. They had seen the fire contact on Calloway's team. They had heard the radio traffic. They had watched the green indicator come back online from a junction that was 800 meters into compromised terrain. They understood the arithmetic. Lena walked directly to the server rack in the corner where she had left her primary workstation active. She unclipped the ruggedized field case from her hip, set it on the table, and opened it. She pulled the encrypted field drive and plugged it into her workstation port. She did not remove the Ruger from her shoulder until she had started the data transfer, and then she set it on the table beside the field case with the same deliberate care she used for all her tools, not carelessly, not with ceremony, simply correctly. Marsh crossed the room toward her. He moved with the measured stride of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it as he walked. He stopped 2 feet from her workstation and looked at the data transfer progress on her screen and then at her face. "Sector Echo is back online," he said. "Yes, sir." "The 3 individuals in the ravine. Disarmed and immobilized. Non-lethal. They'll need medical attention in the next 2 hours." She did not look up from the screen. "Probable location: the North Ravine floor between coordinates November 7 and November 9 and the eastern wall at the Echo 4 position. I marked them on the grid before I left." She pulled up the location data on her tablet and handed it to him without turning. Marsh took the tablet. He looked at the coordinates. He looked at her. He said, "Are you injured?" "No, sir." He nodded once. Then he looked at the data transfer on her screen. "What is that? Lena said, is the reason I need 15 minutes and then a room with you, Hale, and no one else." Something moved in Marsh's expression, not alarm, but the precursor to it. The moment before a man who is very good at not showing alarm begins to show it. 15 minutes, he said. 12 if the transfer completes on schedule. He walked to the center of the room and stood there with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the main display, and he waited with the patient gravity of a man who had learned that the most important discipline a commander could exercise was the discipline of not filling silence before he understood what it contained. Hale was already at the corner table. He had not moved since Lena walked in. He was watching her work with the still, attentive focus of a man reading a text he has read before and finding it says what he remembered it saying. The data transfer completed in 11 minutes. Lena pulled the field drive, closed the transfer window, and stood. She looked at Marsh. She looked at Hale. She said, "Now." The 3 of them walked to the secure briefing room off the TOC's east corridor. Marsh closed the door. Hale stood near it. Lena set her tablet on the briefing table and pulled up the configuration file she had extracted from the junction cabinet. She talked for 4 minutes without stopping. She did not hedge. She did not soften. She laid out the data in the order it needed to be understood. The axis anomalies she had been tracking for 3 weeks. The fingerprint in the logs, the configuration file in the junction cabinet, the modification to Sentinel's threat identification protocol, the triggering conditions, the deployment timeline, and what would happen at the moment of activation if the modification was not removed and the deployment proceeded on schedule. When she finished, the room was completely silent. Marsh stood with both hands flat on the briefing table looking at the configuration file on the tablet screen. His face had the quality of a man who is doing very rapid calculations behind an expression of deliberate stillness, running scenarios and outcomes and implications through a mind that had been doing exactly this kind of work for 30 years. Hale said nothing. He had gone very still near the door in the way of a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed and is giving himself a moment to absorb the confirmation before he moves to the next thing. Marsh said, "Stowe." "Yes, sir." "You're certain?" "The access credentials are hers. The code architecture is consistent with her documented methodology. The timestamp places the insertion 11 days ago during the 40-minute window when she was the sole administrator logged into the system. And the vulnerability she identified in the configuration file." Lena paused for the first time. Not because she was uncertain, because what she was about to say required precision. "It is real. It is exactly as severe as she described it in her reports. I confirmed it independently in the ravine. She was correct about all of it." Marsh looked up from the tablet. She was correct. Her reports were also correct. All three of them. The vulnerability exists. It has existed since the network's third revision. The engineer responsible for the architecture decision that created it is listed by name in Stowe's first report. Lena held his gaze. If those reports had been acted on 8 months ago, none of this morning would have happened. The silence in the room changed quality. It became heavier and more specific. Marsh straightened. He pulled his hands off the table. He stood with the posture of a man absorbing a weight and redistributing it through his frame without letting it show in his face. "Where is Stowe now?" he said. "Server room B," Lena said. "She's been there since 0600. I need to speak with her before you move on her officially." Marsh looked at her. "That is not standard procedure." "No, sir, it is not." A long moment. Marsh and Lena looking at each other across the briefing table with the particular quality of two people communicating something that is not being said in words. Then Marsh said, 5 minutes. Hale stays outside the door." Lena nodded. She picked up her tablet and walked out. Server room B was a long, narrow space on the building's north side. Its walls lined floor to ceiling with rack-mounted processing units that generated a constant low-frequency hum, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. The temperature was held at 68 degrees year-round. The lighting was functional and ungenerous. It was not a comfortable room. It was a room built for machines, and the humans who worked in it adapted to its terms rather than the reverse. Stowe was at the far end, standing at a diagnostic terminal with her back to the door. She was 48 years old, and she carried herself with the straight-back precision of someone who had spent decades in institutions that rewarded correct posture. She had a PhD in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon and a service record that contained more classified entries than unclassified ones, and she had in a seminar room at MIT 11 years ago looked at a 21-year-old graduate student's dissertation draft and said, "The most important skill you can develop is the ability to see what you've built from the perspective of the person who wants to break it." She heard Lena come in. She did not turn around. "I knew it would be you," she said. Her voice was steady. Not the steadiness of someone who was not afraid. The steadiness of someone who had made peace with a decision and was living in its aftermath. Lena walked to the midpoint of the room and stopped. She did not go to the terminal. She did not close the distance into something that felt like a confrontation. She stood where she was in the functional light and said, "Turn around." Stodita turned around. Her face was the face of a person who had not slept well in 8 months. Not haggard, controlled, composed, professionally maintained, but carrying in the area around the eyes and in the set of the mouth, the specific wear of someone who has been living inside a difficult decision for a long time. She looked at Lena with the directness of a person who has given up on oblique approaches. "The vulnerability is real," she said. "I know," Lena said. "I confirmed it an hour ago." Something shifted in Stowe's expression, something that might in a different context have been relief. "Then you understand why—" "I understand why you filed 3 reports," Lena said. "I understand why you felt you had no options left. I understand the logic of every step you took right up until the last one." She paused. "I don't understand the last one." Stowe was quiet for a moment. If I had done nothing, Sentinel would have deployed in 61 hours and 14 installations would have gone blind in the first 60 seconds of activation. I had been told 3 times that the vulnerability was within acceptable parameters, which means the people responsible for making that determination have never built anything, have never seen what acceptable parameters look like when they fail, and were not going to be in any of those 14 installations when it happened. So you built a demonstration? Lena said. I built proof of concept. I didn't want anyone hurt. I wanted the system to fail in a controlled environment before it failed in a real one. 3 men are in a ravine with injuries that require medical attention. The first crack appeared in Stowe's composure. Small, a tightening around the eyes, a slight change in the quality of her breathing. That wasn't supposed to happen. The contractor team I engaged was supposed to create a technical failure, not an armed response. Contracted operations have a way of developing their own logic, Lena said. You know that. Yes, Stowe said quietly. I know that. The hum of the server racks filled the space between them. Somewhere in the processing units to Lena's left, a cooling fan cycled up briefly and then returned to its baseline frequency. Lena said, "What's in the USB drive in your left breast pocket?" Stowe's hand moved involuntarily toward her chest, then stopped. She looked at Lena with something that was not quite surprise and not quite resignation, the expression of a person who has been read accurately and is deciding whether to be relieved or unnerved by it. "Complete documentation," she said. "The vulnerability analysis, the engineering decision log that created it, the name of the program manager who overrode the correction, all 3 formal reports with receipt confirmation and time-stamped acknowledgments, and a proposed patch architecture that would resolve the flaw without requiring a full system rollback." She reached into her breast pocket and held out the drive. Lena looked at it. She looked at Stowe. "You were going to give this to someone," Lena said. "I was going to give it to you," Stowe said. "I knew eventually they'd send someone who could actually read what was in it. I was waiting." A pause. Something passed across her face, something that might have been the residue of the version of this conversation she had rehearsed in the months of waiting. "I taught you to look at what you built from the perspective of someone who wanted to break it. I didn't teach you to become that person. I became it instead. That's the part I can't defend." The room was very quiet. Lena crossed the distance between them and took the drive. She held it for a moment, turning it once in her fingers with the attentive focus she brought to any piece of hardware. Then she looked up at Stowe. "You were right about the vulnerability," she said. "Yes. Your methods endangered people. Yes. I won't minimize that. I'm not asking you to." Lena held the drive for one more second. Then she put it in her plate carrier pocket and said, "Come with me." She turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, after a moment, she heard Stowe's footsteps begin to follow. Measured, steady, carrying the particular weight of someone walking toward a reckoning they have been building toward for 8 months and have decided to meet without flinching. Hale was outside the door. He looked at Lena, he looked at Stowe. He said nothing. He fell in behind them both as they walked down the corridor toward the TOC. The confrontation in Marsh's office lasted 40 minutes. Lena was present for most of it. She said little. She answered the questions directed at her with factual economy and declined to offer interpretation beyond what the data required. She presented the USB drive contents, the configuration file, the access log documentation. She confirmed the vulnerability analysis independently and in her own technical language, and watched the expression on Marsh's face change as the full picture assembled itself in his understanding. Stowe spoke for herself. She was direct and without self-pity, and carried herself through the account of her actions with the straight-back precision of someone who had decided that if this was where it ended, it would end cleanly. She did not ask for leniency. She did not invoke her service record or her rank or the 26 years that stood behind her. She stated what she had done, why she had done it, and what she believed needed to happen now. When it was over, Marsh sat behind his desk in the specific silence of a man who has just assembled a picture he did not want to see and is deciding what to do with it. He looked at Stowe. "You'll be remanded to the duty officer pending formal charges. That process will take its course, and I will not interfere with it in either direction." "Understood, sir." "The vulnerability in Sentinel's threat identification protocol will be addressed before this installation deploys anything to anyone." He looked at Lena. "I want your patch architecture reviewed and ready for implementation in 8 hours. 6, Lena said. Marsh looked at her for a moment. 6 hours. He stood. He walked to the door, opened it, and spoke briefly to the duty sergeant in the corridor. Stowe was escorted out. The door closed. Marsh stood in the middle of his office and looked at Lena, with the evaluating regard of a man who has been assembling a question for several hours and has only now decided to ask it. "How long did you know about the vulnerability?" he said. "Approximately 90 seconds after I accessed the Echo Junction log, roughly 3 hours ago." "Why didn't you communicate it immediately?" Lena held his gaze. "I needed evidence, not a theory. The configuration file, the access log documentation, the USB drive. Without those, I had a hypothesis and a read of technical code that any halfway competent defense attorney would characterize as interpretive." She paused. "You also weren't the first person this morning who would have needed to be convinced." The words "this morning" carried their own weight. They both heard it. Marsh did not have an answer for that. He stood with it for a moment in the silence of a man absorbing a correct observation that reflects badly on his institution and indirectly on himself. And then he nodded once with the deliberate care of someone making a note in a mental ledger he intends to revisit. "I need you in the briefing room in 30 minutes, he said. "Yes, sir." She left his office and walked down the corridor toward the SCIF, and she did not look back. The briefing Marsh called was not the kind with slideshow presentations and structured agendas. He assembled the senior officers and senior NCOs of Fort Haven in the main conference room at 0900, and he stood at the head of the table and he talked for 6 minutes without notes. He talked about Sector Echo. He talked about what had happened in the ravine and what had been found in the junction cabinet and what had been confirmed in the server room afterward. He talked about Sentinel's deployment timeline and the modification to its threat identification protocol and what that modification would have done at the moment of activation. He talked about the 3 formal reports that had been filed, received, and buried. He talked about the 48 hours ahead and what they required. Then he stopped talking. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the conference table. It was a gray access badge, Lena's gray access badge. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at the assembled officers and NCOs, men and women, who had been in the building all morning, who had watched the amber indicator and listened to the fire contact and seen the green come back online, who had processed all of it through the frameworks their training had given them. "The person who carries this badge," Marsh said, "warned us 3 times this morning. 3 times this room looked at this badge before it listened to the words. The badge is gray, the lowest clearance level issued on this installation." He let that sit. "That is not her failure. That is ours." He looked around the table. He did not rush it. He let the weight of it settle on each person in sequence, the way a teacher waits for a room to finish reading before he begins talking. Then he looked at Calloway. Calloway was sitting at the far end of the table. He had come in from the ridge an hour ago, been assessed by medical and cleared, and was sitting now with the particular physical stillness of a man who has been in a loud, fast, violent situation and has not yet fully returned to the frequency of the world around him. There was dried blood on the back of his left hand from a rock fragment. His face was the face of a man in the process of a specific kind of reckoning that has nothing to do with combat and everything to do with recognition. Marsh did not say anything to him. He simply looked at him with the patient directness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the person on the other side of it to arrive at the same place. Calloway looked at the gray badge on the table. He looked at it for a long time. The room was completely still. No one moved. No one filled the silence with anything because the silence had a specific gravity that made filling it feel wrong, not out of protocol, but out of the instinctive recognition that something real was happening at the far end of the table, and interrupting it would cost everyone something they couldn't name. Then Calloway stood. He reached across the table and picked up the badge. He walked the length of the conference room to where Lena was standing near the door, where she had been standing since the briefing began, against the wall, not at the table, in the position of someone who is present as a resource rather than a participant. He stopped in front of her. He was still a foot taller than her. He was still built like something assembled rather than born. None of that had changed, but something in the way he was standing had changed, a change that was difficult to quantify and impossible to miss. The forward lean was gone. The performative weight of a man broadcasting dominance to the room had been replaced by something simpler and considerably heavier. He held out the badge. Lena looked at it. She looked at him. His face was not performing anything. It was not apologetic in the theatrical sense, not constructed for an audience. It was the face of a man who has spent 20 years building his identity on a specific set of values and has just had one of those values demonstrated back to him by the person he had dismissed most thoroughly, and who is deciding in real time what that means for the architecture he has built. He did not make a speech. He did not offer a carefully worded apology designed to preserve dignity. He simply held out the badge and looked at her and let the gesture carry what it needed to carry. It was enough. Lena took it. She turned it once in her fingers, the same attentive motion she had used with the USB drive, and then she looped it back over her neck. The gray badge settled against her chest. For half a second, 1/2 second, that no one in the room would have caught unless they were watching, very carefully her fingers held it a beat longer than necessary before she released it. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. Just one small human pause in the mechanical efficiency of everything she did. Then she let it go. Marsh, watching from the head of the table, noted it with the quiet attention of a man who has spent 30 years learning to read the things that people don't say. He said nothing. He filed it away. The briefing ended. The room began to clear. People moved out into the corridors to do the work that the morning had generated: the medical response for the ravine, the preliminary sentinel patch review, the administrative machinery of what would happen to Stowe, the purposeful, organized motion of an institution processing a crisis and converting it into procedure. Hale caught Lena in the corridor outside the conference room. He fell into step beside her without announcement, which was how he operated. He matched your pace first and found the word second. 6 hours, he said, for the patch architecture. Yes. After that, it's someone else's job to implement it. She glanced at him sideways. You knew about the vulnerability before today. It was not a question. Hale was quiet for 3 steps. I had a read on the access anomalies 4 weeks ago. Different angle than yours. I didn't have the architecture knowledge to interpret what I was seeing. You could have told me. I could have. He paused. I was waiting to see if you'd find it independently. Because if you found it independently, the documentation chain is cleaner, and the evidence holds under scrutiny without someone asking how an off-book CO came to be in possession of administrative log data. Lena stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. Hale met her gaze with the steady neutrality of a man who has done a calculation he is prepared to defend. That was a significant risk to carry quietly, she said. It was a manageable risk, he said, given the operator. They looked at each other for a moment in the corridor's functional light, 2 people communicating in the precise shorthand of professionals who have worked in the same dark corners of the same difficult world and understand each other's methods without needing to approve of all of them. Then Lena turned and kept walking. She spent the next 6 hours in the SCIF. She did not eat. She drank 1 cup of coffee that went cold before she finished it. She worked with the focused intensity of a person who has identified a structural flaw in something they built and is correcting it not out of obligation, not because she had been ordered to, but because the flaw was there and she was the person who understood it best and the work needed to be done correctly. The patch architecture she developed addressed not just the specific modification Stowe had inserted, but the underlying vulnerability in Sentinel's threat identification protocol that had created the exploitable condition in the first place. She went 3 layers deeper than the immediate problem. She documented every change with the precision of someone who expects her work to be reviewed by people who will need to understand it without her present to explain it. At 15:47, she ran the final verification sequence. Green across the board. She saved the architecture documentation to a secure shared drive, accessible to the Sentinel program engineering team. She wrote a summary document for Marsh, clear, technical, comprehensive, and completely free of anything that resembled self-aggrandizement. She described the vulnerability, the patch, the implementation requirements in the testing protocol that should be completed before deployment was rescheduled. She noted in the final paragraph that Lieutenant Colonel Stowe's original vulnerability analysis had been technically accurate in all material respects and recommended that the formal record reflect this. She saved the document. She looked at it on the screen for a moment. Then she closed the window. She began packing her workstation. It did not take long. She had arrived 3 weeks ago with 2 cases of equipment and a tablet, and she was leaving with the same. She worked through the disconnection and packing sequence. Systematically, cables coiled and labeled drives, secured, diagnostic tools returned to their cases. The SCIF workstation was returned to its base configuration. All her user data purged, the desk left exactly as she had found it. She placed the field drive with the Echo Junction data on the desk beside the secure shared drive access card. Evidence preservation. Someone would need both. She picked up the 2 cases. She looked at the desk one more time. It was clean and bare and showed no evidence of 3 weeks of work. She turned off the workstation light. She walked out. She stopped by the equipment staging room and left the Ruger on the table where Hale had first placed it. She did not leave a note. The rifle was his to account for. He would know where it had been and what it had done. She walked to the contractor quarters, retrieved her personal kit, 1 bag compact, and carried it to the external access door on the building's western side. It was 0447 when she stepped outside. The snow had stopped hours ago. The sky was that specific pre-dawn darkness that is not quite black, a deep clarified gray that carries in it the early structural suggestion of the light that is coming. The air was cold and sharp and completely still. Fort Haven sat quiet around her, the nighttime rhythm of guard rotations and distant generator hum and the occasional radio exchange that filled the base's sleeping hours. A black SUV without license plates was idling at the western perimeter gate. She had not arranged it. She had not needed to. There was a person in the NSA director's office who had an algorithm that monitored certain operational parameters and generated certain vehicle requests automatically when those parameters were met. She walked toward it. The gate guard, a young private 20 years old at most, with the specific combination of alertness and uncertainty that new soldiers carry on night shifts, watched her approach. He looked at her gray badge. He looked at her 2 cases in her kit bag. He looked at the black SUV. He opened the gate. She walked through. Hale was standing at the edge of the vehicle parking area 40 feet from the gate. She had not expected him there. He was in his physical training gear, which meant he had been awake and decided to be here rather than woken up and called. He was standing with his hands at his sides in the stillness of a man who has positioned himself to be seen and is waiting without demanding acknowledgement. She stopped when she reached him. They stood for a moment in the pre-dawn gray. The SUV idled 20 feet away. Somewhere on the other side of the installation, a door opened and closed in the wind. Hale raised his right hand to his forehead in the specific manner, 2 fingers clean angle held for a precise beat. That was not the salute of formal military ceremony. It was the gesture of one professional acknowledging another, carrying in its economy exactly the weight it was intended to carry, and nothing more and nothing less. Lena looked at him, then she gave him a single nod, small, definite, the nod of someone who has received a communication and confirmed receipt. She walked to the SUV, put her cases in the back, and got in. The SUV pulled away from Fort Haven at 0451 and moved down the installation access road toward the state highway, its taillights the only red in all that gray pre-dawn. Hale watched the taillights disappear at the bend in the access road. He stood at the perimeter gate for another 30 seconds after they were gone, looking at the place where they had been. The young private had retreated to his post. The generator hum filled the pre-dawn quiet, a constant, unnoticed frequency that the people who lived inside Fort Haven had long since stopped hearing. Hale had been in this business for 15 years. He had worked with operators across 4 branches of service and alongside people from agencies that did not appear on organizational charts and in countries whose names did not appear in his official travel documentation. He had developed over those 15 years a specific and reliable sense for the quality of the people he encountered, not their rank, not their records, not the accumulation of institutional credentials that filled their files, but the actual quality of their judgment and their nerve and their precision when those things were being tested by something that was genuinely trying to break them. He had worked alongside a small number of people who operated at the level Lena Voss operated at. He could count them without running out of fingers on one hand. He turned and walked back toward the main building. He would file his report, the after-action documentation that would be classified at a level that meant it would be read by fewer than a dozen people, and in that report he would describe in the dry, technical language of official documentation what had happened in the ravine and the TOC and the server room and the briefing. He would describe it accurately. He would not editorialize. He would not use words like extraordinary or exceptional because those words meant different things to different readers and carried the risk of being interpreted as hyperbole by people who had not been in the room. He would simply describe what she had done in sequence with the specific details that allowed someone reading the account to understand the difficulty of each component, the terrain approach, the tactical problem, the technical repair, the configuration file, the 6-hour patch architecture, the timestamp. He would let the facts carry the weight. That was, he had found, the most reliable form of tribute he knew how to offer someone who operated the way she operated. Not performance, not proclamation, just the record set down with the care and precision that the record deserved. He went inside. The door closed behind him. Calloway found the skiff empty at 0630. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. He looked at the clean desk, the bare workstation, the absence of every indicator that the space had been occupied by anyone doing anything. He looked at the field drive and the access cards side by side on the desk surface, left with the precision of someone who leaves things exactly where they need to be found. He walked to the workstation and looked at it. Then he turned and looked at the main display that was still running the base network status overview. Sentinel's sensor grid showed solid green across all sectors, not the restored green of a system patched back to its previous state. A deeper, more settled green, the status indicator of a network that had been rebuilt more correctly than it had existed before. All 14 installation nodes, all online, all correctly configured, all carrying in their architecture the correction of a flaw that had existed for 4 years without anyone finding it, except the person who had spent enough time thinking about how the system could be broken to understand how it needed to be made whole. The timestamp on the last patch implementation read 0447. Calloway looked at it for a while. He thought about the armory and the gray badge and the 4 sentences that had been correct about everything. He thought about the ravine and the silence that had arrived from a direction he had not been watching and could not explain. He thought about the conference room and the badge on the table and the moment when the right response had been simply to stand up and walk to the other end of the room and hold something out. He pulled a chair to the desk and sat down. He sat there for a while in the quiet of the SCIF in the blue light of the corrected network display, thinking about the kinds of things that men who have been very confident for a very long time think about in the mornings after they discover the specific dimensions of what they did not know. It was not comfortable. It was not supposed to be. It was, in its way, a beginning. The formal proceedings that followed were not public and were not swift. Stowe was remanded and charged, and the institutional machinery that processed her case moved with the grinding slowness of an organization that had spent 26 years accumulating her service record on one side of its scales and was now obligated to weigh what she had done against all of it. The most difficult moment in those proceedings, the moment that the few people present would carry longest, was not when the charges were read or when Stowe entered her plea. It was when the independent engineering panel presented their findings and confirmed in the flat institutional language of a formal review that her vulnerability analysis had been correct in all material respects, that the flaw was real, that the 3 reports had been received and logged and not acted upon. The panel chair read the findings without inflection, as if reading a weather report, and the room was very quiet while he read. Stowe sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and her back straight, and her face carrying the specific expression of a person who has been waiting a long time to hear something said aloud and is now hearing it and finding that it costs more than they expected, not because the words were wrong, but because being right about something for 8 months while no one listened extracts a price that vindication does not fully refund. She was not destroyed. She was not exonerated. She was processed by the institutional machinery she had spent 26 years serving with all the grinding slowness and imperfect justice that machinery produced. What came out the other side was something that did not fit cleanly into the category of punishment or the category of mercy, but occupied the difficult space between them where most real decisions about complicated people ultimately reside. The name of the program manager whose architecture decision had created the flaw was entered into the official record. The 3 reports were retrieved from administrative storage and entered alongside them. Some records survive. These did. Sentinel's deployment was postponed 14 weeks for a full architectural review. It was redesigned with Lena's patch incorporated as a foundational element. When it eventually deployed, it deployed correctly. The 14 installations never knew how close they had come. Calloway was reassigned to the Leadership Development Program at Quantico 8 months after the events at Fort Haven. The reassignment was his own request, the first request of that kind he had ever made in 20 years of service. He became an instructor for pre-deployment leadership training, and the first unit of his first course was not about tactics or terrain or threat assessment. It was about the difference between the rank someone carries and the knowledge they hold, about the specific costly error of confusing volume with authority, about what it looks like when an institution mistakes presence for competence. He told the story of Fort Haven in the first class of every rotation. He told it without omission and without the softening that time and self-regard naturally apply to stories that reflect poorly on the teller. He told the part about the armory where he had used the wrong words to the wrong person and mistaken her silence for submission. He told the part about the briefing room where he had heard the correct analysis and rejected it because of where it came from rather than what it said. He told the part about the ravine where 4 of his men had bled because he had led them into exactly the trap he had been warned about by the person he had refused to listen to. And he told the part about sitting in the SCIF at 0630 looking at a network his people had been protecting, and that a woman with a gray badge had rebuilt while they were asleep, fixing not just the failure of the night, but the deeper failure that had been quietly accumulating in the system for 4 years before anyone with the right eyes had been willing to look. He told all of it, without a self-serving frame, without the editorial adjustments that pride installs so automatically in the stories we tell about our own failures that we stop being able to see them. He told it because the point was not his redemption. The point was the next generation of leaders sitting in front of him who had not yet made the specific mistake he had made, but who carried the potential for it, the way every person trained to operate in high-stakes environments carries the potential for it, and who needed to understand what it looked like from the inside before they found themselves living it from the outside. He showed them the gray badge. He had kept it, not Lena's, which had been retired and replaced somewhere in the machinery of her continuing work, but a replica he had requisitioned for exactly this purpose, issued at the lowest clearance level Fort Haven assigned to any contractor. He held it up at the start of every class and set it on the table in front of him and said, before you dismiss what someone is telling you, ask yourself whether you're looking at this instead of listening to them. Ask yourself what it would cost you and the people who depend on you if you were wrong. The young NCOs in his classes looked at the badge. Most of them did not fully understand it yet. Understanding would come later in the field in the specific moments when their own version of the armory seemed played out, and they would either remember this conversation or they would not. Calloway knew this. He had been in enough classrooms on both sides of the instruction to understand that the best a teacher could do was plant something that had a chance of growing later. The planting was the work. The growing was theirs. He became over time a better teacher than he had been a soldier, which was saying something, because he had been a very good soldier. He never saw Lena Voss again. He did not expect to. People like Lena did not circle back to the places they had already fixed. The work called them forward, always forward, toward the next system and the next gap and the next flaw that no one else had yet found. As for Lena herself, the record of her movements after Fort Haven was the kind of record that is technically complete and practically opaque. Travel authorizations to locations that were not identified by name. Project assignments with classification levels that turned her role descriptions into redacted blocks. The gray badge from Fort Haven was formally retired and replaced by another gray badge at another installation with another administrative designation that told the people who read it nothing about the person who carried it. She continued the work. The work was never the same twice because the systems changed and the threats against them changed, and the specific knowledge required to understand the gap between them changed with every new design and every new vulnerability that someone clever and determined enough to look for it eventually found. The work was never done because the architecture of what needed protecting was always expanding, and the architecture of what wanted to break it was always learning. But she continued it with the same precision, with the same filtering of irrelevant data, with the same quality of absolute unperformative calm that had been her primary operating characteristic since anyone who knew her could remember. She thought sometimes about Stowe, not about what Stowe had done or what it had cost. Those were facts that the record held accurately and that did not require her attention to remain true. She thought about the specific 11 years of distance between a seminar room at M1T and a server room in Virginia, and the way that distance had folded in on itself in the space of a single morning until the teacher and the student were standing 5 feet apart in the functional light of a room full of machines, each holding one half of a problem that neither of them could have solved alone. She thought about the 8 seconds at the workstation when she had put the tablet down and looked at the wall and allowed herself to simply be a person for the duration of one deliberate pause. She thought about that more than she thought about the ravine or the junction cabinet or the 41 seconds in the opening snow. The technical work was her nature. The 8 seconds were the choice. And she had made that choice and absorbed what it cost and picked the tablet back up and kept going. And she thought that it was in some way she had no particular interest in articulating the right answer to the question that the 8 seconds had been asking. She moved through systems the way water moves through rock, not dramatically, not with announcement, finding the spaces, the gaps, the places where something had been built with a flaw it didn't know it had, filling those spaces, moving on. Somewhere on some installation she had not yet reached a sensor array was running on a network that carried somewhere in its architecture a flaw that no one had yet identified. Someone had built it correctly except for the one thing they had missed, and the thing they had missed was the thing that mattered, and no one with the authority to fix it had yet understood what they were looking at. She was on her way. She carried a gray badge. She was very good at filtering out background noise. And somewhere behind her, in all the installations she had already passed through, 14 sets of sensors continued running solid green, protected not by the volume of the people who defended them, but by the quiet precision of someone who understood them well enough to know exactly what they needed. The snow was falling somewhere, soft, the quiet kind. She did not notice it. She had work to do.